Strawberries are pretty forgiving. Once you get them established, they can get almost weedy, and you can have them for years and years. They're going to get smaller and smaller every year, though. After about 3 years of production, the berry size is going to decrease. But when we talk about strawberries, we're essentially talking about 3 different types. We're talking about everbearing. You hear a lot of people say they want those everbearing strawberries. The everbearing, they have 3 different flowering and fruiting periods. It'll be in the spring, then you'll get a crop in the summer, you'll get a crop in the fall. And all those harvests will be relatively small compared to the June bearing varieties. They don't have a whole lot of runners, so that's not something you have to deal with much with the everbearers. They don't have as much fruit, and probably the classic example of everbearing strawberry is the Ozark Beauty. You almost always hear somebody mention the Ozark Beauty when they're talking about everbearing varieties. June bearing, I'm personally the biggest fan of the 3. This is what I like best. Also called spring bearing. They only have 1 harvest period, and that comes along in May or June, and you harvest for about 2 to 3 weeks, and then you're done. They have a whole lot of runners, so if you plant 1 row of June bears and leave them alone in a few years, it's going to spread into a big wide weedy patch. And examples would be the early glow that I showed you earlier and the all-star. Those are the June bearers. And then you have day neutral varieties. They produce fruit throughout the growing season, just kind of a consistent production. But again, much smaller production than you have with the June bears. They don't have many runners, and examples would be Tribute and TriStar. Those are the day neutrals. When your plants arrive, if you order strawberry plants, they usually come in bundles of 25, and they're usually going to come at the absolute worst time to plant. They'll come when it's cold and it's wet and muddy. So what you're probably going to do is, if you can't get them in the refrigerator, kind of preserve them until it's planting time, you can do what's called heeling in, and that's where you just dig a trench about 6 inches deep and V-shaped, and you just open up that bundle, lay your roots out in that trench, and then pull a little moist soil over those roots, and they'll keep like that just fine. The year I planted my strawberries, I had, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so left over that I just left in this trench that I didn't bother with, and they took root, and they produce every year just like the others do. But you can also, if you don't want to deal with this, like I said, you can put them in the refrigerator. Be careful if you've got onions or apples or anything like that in the refrigerator, because those things produce an ethylene gas, and it can cause the buds on your strawberry plants to abort. So just be aware of that. Heeling in is probably going to be the best situation. Okay, spacing is always a question. Most people are going to go. They're going to space their strawberries about 2.5 feet from one plant to the other, and they're going to have about a 3.5 to 4 foot distance between the rows. And if you're looking at doing a whole acre, that column on the right tells you how many plants you need for an acre based on that spacing, around 5,000. It's kind of important with strawberries to be careful about what you're following. If you've got a patch where you grew any of this stuff last year, potatoes, tobacco, peppers, eggplants, I wouldn't plant my strawberries there, because there's a fungal disease called verticillium wilt, and it can linger in the soil, and it's gonna wipe out your strawberries. So I wouldn't follow any of those crops. I also wouldn't follow sod. If you got a grassy area, I wouldn't till it up and plant strawberries the same year, because it's going to have a whole lot of grubs, and those white grubs will damage your strawberry roots. So if you got a grassy area you want to turn into do a strawberry patch, what I would do is I'd till it up and plant a garden there this year, and then I'd plant the strawberries next year. And it's going to produce your grub crop. Legumes are pretty good to follow. So if you had this sod and you tilled it up this year, you could plant some clover in there, and then come back next year and plant your strawberries, and you're going to get them off to a pretty good start. So legumes are pretty good to follow. Any kind of barnyard manure is ideal for strawberries, and it's best to plow that in the fall before you plant. You know, horse, rabbit, cow, or chicken, all that manure is good for strawberries. Has anybody heard the joke about the farmer who's got a load of manure? Somebody asks what it's for, and he says I'm going to put it on my strawberries. And they say, well, I'll put sugar on mine. You want to plant your strawberries as early as the ground can be worked in March or April. So right now, if you had strawberry plants, now would be the best time to plant. You're actually getting a little too late to plant them, but so you can still get them out, get them in the ground. And when you get these, and I've never bought strawberries from a retail store, so I don't know if the roots are as long, but if you order them, you'll pull some out that'll have roots this long. It's very monstrous roots. And you want to prune them back to about 5 or 6 inches. Because if they're too long, what they're going to do is you're going to get J rooting, so those roots are going to be curved up like a J, and the plants are just not going to do as well. So you want to chop those back about 5 or 6 inches before you put them in the ground. And when you plant, you want to try to spread the roots out as best you can. This is another thing to be careful about. When you get those plants, you'll be able to see what's called a crown. And there might be some old leaves on the crown. I'll just go ahead and pull those old leaves off. And you want to plant so that crown is where it was in its original bed. You don't want to go too high. You don't want the crown up here with the roots above the ground level. You don't want the crown too low, below the ground level. You want to get it so that crown is above ground, the roots are below. But again, should be able to look at the plants and tell roughly where that crown is situated in the nursery. Okay, your first growing season, and here's some critical temperatures you can remember for your strawberries. But if you've got buds that popped out on the plant but they haven't opened up yet, they're fine down to 10 degrees, so I wouldn't worry about them otherwise. If you've got buds that are about to open but they're still closed up pretty tight, they're safe down to about 22 to 27 degrees. If you have flowers open up on your strawberry plants, then really 30 degrees can lock those out. So that's when you need to be worried. And you can tell when the freeze has killed your strawberries, because if you look at those flowers and it's got a black dot in the center, then that flower is dead and you're not going to get any fruit from it. Again, a hard thing to do to pinch off the balloons. What I did when I planted mine, I kept about 4 or 5 that I didn't pinch the balloons off of, just so I could taste them the first year. But you really want to pinch those balloons off and let those roots develop. Weed control is probably the biggest challenge with your strawberries because they grow dense and you've got weeds popping up everywhere. But that first year, you really want to keep those weeds under control so those plants can get established. And you're going to have to spend a lot of time behind the hoe to get that all worked out. And I think my first year, I crawled through 100 plants and just pulled weeds out by hand just to give my plants a competitive edge. Another thing with the June bears, that first year, you're going to have runners popping everywhere. So you want to come up with a good system to manage those. If you've got another bed set aside somewhere, you can cut those runners off and transplant them, then that's going to be fine. You're going to keep sort of a perpetual strawberry system going. When we start to get into winter, when we get into December, and you look at the forecast, and the first time they're calling for temperatures close to 20 degrees, then you want to take your mulch out, your straw mulch, and mulch those plants very thickly, because those crowns are sensitive to that cold injury. So you want to mulch them pretty heavily before we hit 20-degree weather. And then in the spring, don't do this too early, don't do it too late. Just kind of time it when those plants are starting to pop out and the cold weather's over. But rake that mulch back away from your strawberry plant. And another thing I've seen people do, and I did this accidentally one year, is people will plant different types of grass crops, perennial grasses or annual grasses in the rows of the strawberries. Sudan grass is an example of what they'll use. And they can go through and when that's winter kill, they can just cut it down or just let it fall naturally, and it'll cover over those strawberry plants. This was a pretty clever system, I thought, for managing those runners and having strawberries that produce year after year. And for those of you who have internet, you can find this on it's strawberryplants.org. And it's got this system in here, but this is year one, or your fruited year one. So if you planted your strawberries this year, this would be in 2015. You'd have this entire bed, and you have a second bed where you put your runners. You cut off your runners and put them in the second bed. So year two, this one will be fruiting. This one will be in its first year of fruiting, and you do the same thing. Cut those runners off, put them in the third bed, and then so on. And at the end of year three, you would renovate your first bed, and then put your runners from bed 4 back into bed 1. And just keep that rotation system going. Because your strawberries will produce pretty good for about 3 years, and then they need to be renovated, because the production goes down, your berries will get smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you can keep some kind of system like this where you're rotating, getting rid of the old plants after about 3 years, and continually replanting those runners, then you're going to have a more sustained production. A lot more labor intensive, but you will get good fruit production. Any questions about this? Everybody understand this system more or less? You've also got the option, in this part of the world, you can do strawberries as an annual, and that's what a lot of our U-pick commercial operations will do. And the variety of choice most people will use is called Chandler. And the way they'll do it is they'll plant them in the fall, they'll harvest the following spring, and then pull them up and start all over. So they treat it just like an annual crop. And you can do it in plasticulture. It works really well in plastic. But it cuts down on a lot of the weed issues, because you're planting past the time the weeds are a problem, and you're harvesting before a lot of those weeds come in, and then you're just renovating from that. But that is one option for doing it as an annual crop. And I'm about out of time here, but I'll talk a little bit about blackberries. This picture was taken in North Carolina, and it's in a high tunnel. And for those of you who don't know what a high tunnel is, it's just essentially an unheated greenhouse. There are some cost share programs that the USDA does to help folks buy high tunnels. But raspberries and blackberries both do very well in high tunnel production because you tend to get really perfect fruits. If you grow blackberries and raspberries out in the open, and they will grow fairly well out in the open, but you get a lot of disfigured fruits, some that are kind of crooked, some that are falling apart, but you get more consistency under a high tunnel. And Penn State University, if you're ever interested in doing this and you want to research raspberries in high tunnels, they've done a lot of research on that, and they say you can get 3 pretty good harvests from raspberries every year underneath the high tunnel. I know a grower who does some tomatoes and cucumbers in a high tunnel, and I've tried to talk for years, talking into growing a few raspberries to get a little more diversity in there. And I think I think this year he's considering doing that. 3 types of blackberries that we'll talk about. We've got the semi-erect. The semi-erect doesn't need trellising, but it's okay to trellis it. Cattle panels are really good for a trellis system. The spacing with the semi-erect blackberries will be about 10 to 12 feet between rows and 2 to 3 feet between plants. These are the sweetest and the most hardy of the 3 types I'm going to be talking about. So the semi-erect varieties. And again, on page 2 of this handout, there are several erect and semi-erect varieties of blackberries that you can look at that do well in Virginia. Another type is semi-trailing. Semi-trailing, it has larger fruit. It blooms a little later, so it gets us out of that cold period a little better. It does require a trellis. I wouldn't attempt to grow it without a trellis. Spacing is going to be a little more, 12 to 13 feet between the rows, about 8 feet between the plants. But again, it's not as sweet and it's not as hardy as the semi-erect. And then the trailing varieties, ones that stay on the ground, like the dewberry and the boysenberry would be examples. They're not very winter hardy here in the mountains, so I wouldn't attempt to grow any of those. Propagation of the semi-erect varieties can be done pretty easily by tip layering. So if you've got these semi-erect blackberries that you like, you can come in August, let the tips of these canes touch the ground, and then just cover it with some loose soil or leaves. And by the next spring, those will have popped up, and you can cut those off and transplant them somewhere else. But they're very easy to propagate that way. And they're kind of like the strawberries. Once you get them established, they're kind of hard to kill. They're going to hang around. There are some disease problems that you may run into, but they are pretty hardy. All right, pruning blackberries. Just a few things you want to do in the summer. Go in and just pinch the tips of them off to encourage them to get more lateral growth. As we get into the fall and the winter, if you've got those older canes that fruited last year, you want to remove those, cut them off at the ground, and just kind of thin them off and shorten those lateral stalks a little bit. But again, just like with the blueberries, the main thing is to get rid of those old canes, because they're not going to have the fruit production that the newer canes do. And then the last thing I'll mention here, gooseberries and currants. I think they've got a real place on the homestead in small quantities, because these will do pretty good in partial shade. So you've got your other berries planted in a nice sunny location. If you've got something near the house or near the barn that's a little more shady, the gooseberries and the currants do very well in partial shade. So it gives you a little variety. You can use some of that space that you might not otherwise use. One warning I'll give you, the black currants are illegal in Virginia, and that goes back many years. There was a white pine disease that spends part of its year in the black currants and another part of the year in the white pines. And so a lot of states still have laws against the black currants, and Virginia is one of them. So you can't legally grow black currants here in Virginia. Gooseberries, some of you may be familiar with them. They're pretty good to eat right off the vine, but the currants are going to be a little bit more tart. People like to use those in pies and other types of cooking. But any questions about any of those? Quiet group.
I mean, you do the black raspberries. How do you propagate the black raspberry? I've got something to help.
You can do, for sure. You can do the tip layering with the black raspberries too. Yeah, so you can bend those over, cover up the tips, and they'll pop out. Anything else? Well, thank you all for coming out. If you